Last one is past versus present.
Yeah. I think some of our mistrust in kind of what the government is telling us is safe or what is an accepted standard is some of this issue of, well, didn't you change your mind? Like PCBs, right? They were widely used and they were considered safe, but now they're banned. I mean, you've done this before, you've changed your mind before. And so I think this sort of undermines people's trust in these big governmental agencies. And this is definitely where my life is coming full circle and my environmental consulting experience comes into play. We really can't expect people in 1920 or even 1970 to have the same environmental knowledge as we do today. Yes, we're going to hold them to the same standard or today's standards of cleaning up what pollution they caused, but we can't hold them to today's standards in terms of knowledge. And so things like PCBs and asbestos, they were used so ubiquitously because they were the best solution for the problem at that time. And this is what I think is just so fascinating. Exactly the reason why PCBs are so problematic in the environment now, which is they don't really degrade, they basically persist forever, is the very reason they were so useful in our technologies. They're so incredibly stable. They're so incredibly fire safe. We use them in large transformers in electrical substations. So, people are lamenting the fact that we use PCBs and it's like, well, do you like electricity? These were the best solutions at the time and nobody has a crystal ball. We've learned about the ecological effects. We've learned about potential low dose chronic exposure, things that were not obvious. And guess what? Bans and regulations and laws have followed because of that increase in knowledge. And so some of this stuff is like, our knowledge and our technology advances such that things change and will continue to change. More studies get done. Technology advances. Like I said, we're able to test for things that we weren't before. This happens in environmental sciences too. We relook at the data. And so contrary to popular belief, science is messy, unclear, and evolving, right? We don't fully understand how some of these things are going to affect us in the long term. And generally, that's not what people want to hear. But we kind of have to accept that that's what it is. And there will continue to be more bans and more regulations, I think, forever. And this stuff, that's my environmental experience. But this stuff happens with pharmaceutical drugs. Stuff goes on the market and then it's pulled. We've even had this with hormones that have been used in animals. There's a hormone DES that was used in the 70s as a growth promoter. That was pulled after it was linked to cancer. So it was banned in 1979. And so the main point here is, yes, things have changed. Yes, they have, quote, changed their mind. But I don't think it should undermine your trust because really they're adapting and changing when the evidence is clear that we need to adapt and change. And so we can't keep thinking, well, you didn't know about PCBs in 1960 when no one was concerned about them and no one wasn't testing in the environment for their contamination. So why should I trust you now? Instead, it's like, okay, people grow and evolve. Science grows and evolve. Policy is going to grow and evolve. And I really think that's the best that we can sort of expect and ask of them.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think a lot of that comes back down to things we've talked about before, which is risk, really, to a large degree, and just even understanding risk enough to understand what the decision is at the other end of that understanding to a degree, right?
Totally. Yeah. Yeah, risk. Risk is a tough one. I know people take this stance that no chemicals should ever be used until they're perfectly determined that they will be safe in all uses and all conditions. It's a nice idea, but if we were to ban every possible new invention until we have 20 or 50 or whatever years of data that it's perfectly safe, there will be no invention. We're trying to solve problems for today. We're trying to solve medical problems today. We're trying to solve food problems today. We're trying to solve fire safety issues in electrical substations today. And so even though we'd love to know how this is going to work out in 50 years, we really just do the best we can with our current knowledge and then change and adapt when we have new information. And like I said, it's really nice to kind of Monday morning quarterback, and I'll use the PCB example again, because I spent 7 years dealing with these issues. But what's really interesting now that I like to bring up about the PCB issue is it's still contested of whether or not there's long-term low-dose chronic effects of them, that it's still not conclusive of whether or not some of these workers who had very high exposure in these various factories have, for example, higher incidence of cancer. It's not been proven that it has. And so there's a risk in everything. There's risks in driving your cars. There's risks in taking plane rides. And you've knowingly accepted the risk with each one of those innovations. And I think people have a really hard time seeing those decisions as the same as something like a pesticide, right? They're like, well, driving my car, that's not the same as, eating something that has a low level of pesticide on it. And I would say it's not. I would say it's only because you understand the risks so well. You understand the whole situation so well. With driving, for example, you know very intimately how to decrease your risks, seatbelts, speed limits, don't text, all of that stuff. I would argue the toxicologists are doing the same thing from the standards front. They understand how the chemicals work. They understand how it's affecting your body. They understand how to minimize risks by putting in these safety factors that we discussed. And so it really is the same thing. It's approaching these unknown risks or these risks in the most conservative way.
Well, it's funny it's not funny. It's not a surprise at all, actually. How many concepts and ideas that we've talked about it across the 50 plus episodes we've done, how many of them start to feel really connected to me as we kind of unpack one. It's like, oh, that's kind of like that one. And it's similar to that one. And a couple that pop into mind just from this conversation is, we just did an episode on marketing. I think it was a subscriber only episode, but really good. Like, it was the marketing claims that you find most often to be failing when looked at with any amount of, intelligence, really. And then we've talked about things like the worried well, right? Supplements and the worried well. And that, to me, those are the things that pop into my head as I listen to you break down these four things, these four misunderstandings, in the sense of science doesn't have a good marketing department. It just doesn't.
That's a
in
good
the same
one.
way that fruits and vegetables, they have a really bad brand. They have bad marketing. Right? There's just not enough money there. Whereas on the flip side, there's so much money in making us fearful of things that perhaps we don't need to be fearful of, right? That idea of the worried well, which I think, if folks haven't listened to that episode, I think it's just for that concept alone is worth listening to, if nothing else. And it's interesting to me that the organic fits nicely in those buckets as well.
Yeah.
And so I guess my question to you is the logical question, which is kind of like, now what?
Yeah.
Or what do we do here? But you said one thing that I really loved, and it's hard to do, and I get it, because it's hard for us to ask questions if we aren't comfortable or confident that we can figure out the answers. But you said in one of those, you said, like, okay, you've got this information, this quote unquote data. Does it matter?
Yeah.
Like, I think that's a really good, tangible, useful question or useful thing to do after yet another headline about, fill in the blank is going to kill us. And so beyond that, or on top of that, or what else can we start to do, maybe just to see things more clearly?
Yeah, I think we might have mentioned this also coming full circle and maybe the Best Diet of the Year podcast. But, I'm not against mainstream media, although I know sometimes it sounds like I am. I'm not against books, mainstream books. I'm not against podcasts, hence I have one. But I think the thing that we have to do with all of these things that are not primary research or when we're not an expert in a field is keep an open mind that we are barely scratching the surface, barely. That people have spent their entire lives studying something that was mentioned in one kind of bullet point in this podcast. People have spent PhDs researching how chemicals travel in the bedrock. There's experts in every different chemical out there. You name a chemical, there's experts that have spent their entire life to being an expert in that. So I think the thing is to keep an open mind that maybe we're just scratching the surface when we're kind of in the mainstream. And that's fine. It's exposing you to potentially different ideas. It might be exposing you to some of these different sides. Well, what about the ethical considerations? Well, what about the environmental considerations? Well, what about the cost considerations, right? But to keep an open mind that we might not have the whole story. And the more that I've looked into any sort of issue, the more that I've realized the answer is not simple. And so if you're like, especially these controversial ones that that we get so spun up about, that if you're like, oh my gosh, I think it's just this government conspiracy theory and they're all trying to kill us, that you can sort of wrap up in this fun little passionate soundbite. I have a feeling that you don't have the whole story. And that's certainly been my truth as I continue to learn in different fields. Is like, wow, this is really complicated. And wow, people have been looking at this for their entire life, and they don't still necessarily have all of the answers either. And so maybe just kind of take that inquisitive perspective of what don't I know? And maybe even, I mean, gosh, this might be a little rose-colored glasses for you, Patrick, but maybe why would what we're currently doing be the best solution? Maybe it's the result of all of these experts that have gone before us and somehow have come to consensus at this idea. Like, what could possibly be so good about conventional produce, for example, and maybe try to keep that open mind. And not that it's the best solution and not that we can't involve it. And I think that we should still put pressure on it. But there must be something about it that it has become the solution that exists today.